بسم الله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بك. Alhamdulillah. This is, remind me what lesson this is? This is lesson 4, isn't it? Of module 4. So we have the class tonight and we have a class next week and we'll conclude module 4 inshallah. So we'll do some review as well because this one requires that we administer a test, but inshallah it won't be as complex as the module 1 test. It's really about the nuts and bolts of purification, not covering every single detail, but the main things that we need to remember. So in our last class we were talking about the Ghusl, the tayammum, the dry wudu, and wiping over bandages and cast. And prior to this we were talking about wudu, and prior to that we were talking about the different types of water and what kind of water we can use and what kinds of water we cannot use in wudu. So just to do a little bit of recap and review, we want to just remind ourselves of the bare bones basics, the absolute minimum for a valid ghusl. We talked about the things that require the ghusl, that make it obligatory, but what are the basic bare bones steps that one must take to have a valid ghusl? Well, we see it in the slide. The basic way of ghusl, the bare minimum, is to rinse the entire mouth once, to rinse the entire nose once, and to wash the entire body, making sure that water reaches every part of the body, making sure that there's no areas where it doesn't reach. And this is the bare minimum, but is that the ideal? No, it's not the ideal, because there are lots of sunnahs that we should be doing when making the ghusl. And as we mentioned in the previous class, if a person purposely ignores the sunnah practices, and this becomes a regular thing for them, where they just do the bare minimum here while purposely neglecting the sunnahs, that can reach a degree of being sinful. So one should not neglect the sunnahs. One of the things we also discussed was the issue of braids in ghusl. Who can remind us what's the difference between men and women when it concerns braids and ghusl? What's the difference? Right, for men it's obligatory to loosen the braids, to whatever you call that. I don't know what the verb is. What do you call it? Unfasten the braids, untie the braids. And for women, they're allowed to retain them. They're allowed to keep them. Why is there this difference between men and women? Yes. It is a rukhsa, meaning it's a dispensation. It's something that's made easy for women, where they're not required to unfasten the braids when making the ghusl, as long as water reaches the roots. Right? But for men, they have to undo them, because for women it's a kind of adornment, and it's in their house and it's for their husbands, and they're allowed to keep them in the ghusl as long as the water reaches the roots. And we don't have any brothers here wearing braids, but if we ever do, you know what to do now. Okay. So this is again the bare minimum. One shouldn't stick to this. They should also include the sunnahs of the ghusl as well. And these sunnahs, we said, are number 1, the tasmiyah, to say Bismillah or Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim while having the intention. So this is a sunnah in the ghusl, to have the intention while saying Bismillah, and to begin with washing the hands up to the wrist. So a person's in the shower, the water's on, they say Bismillah, they wash their hands up to the wrist. They then wash away any najasa, any impurities that may be on them, if there are any on them. What constitutes najasa? We're going to talk about that very soon. They wash this away. They wash the sexual organs, even if there's no noticeable impurities. And then they make wudu as they would make wudu for prayer. And after they've done that, they pour water over their body 3 times, beginning with the head and then the right shoulder, then the left shoulder, and then working the way down with pouring the water. And the other sunnah one should do is to rub the body. So this is called dalk. And in the school of Imam Malik, this is wajib, you have to do it. In the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, it is a sunnah, it's recommended. It's not a condition for the validity of the ghusl, which means it's a sunnah that you don't just pour the water where it comes into contact with the body, but you also rub those parts. So let's say you're washing your back. It is sufficient if water just hits your back, but it's superior in its sunnah to also have your hand or any other object come in contact with the skin of the back and rub that area, and to do all of this successively without pausing like wudu. It shouldn't be too long. So if you put all of these together, you have a basic ghusl that fulfills the obligations as well as all of the sunnahs. And then of course there are certain adab that we talked about with regards to wudu that in many ways apply to the ghusl. Now some of you emailed and you had a series of questions about these matters. What I want to do is save them up towards the end so we can address them, because a lot of these questions will answer themselves, we'll know the answers ourselves once we've covered all the material. So instead of answering them now, we'll know the answers by the time we're done with this. Some of them relate to this issue. Okay, so we then talked about tayammum, and I asked by a show of hands, how many of you have ever made tayammum? Can I get a show of hands again? Right, so a fair number of you have, and it's something that almost every one of us is going to encounter and do at some point in their life, either due to lacking water and being somewhere where there's no water, or being sick to the point where we're not able to use water. So according to the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, the tayammum, or this dry wudu, which is mentioned in the Quran, is permissible when there is, or when there are certain valid excuses that allow it. One of the excuses is being about 1 Hashimi mile away from water. The Hashimi mile is not like our mile. I don't remember the exact number of feet in a mile. It's 5,280. Okay. So the Hashimi mile is 1.16 kilometers, miles, sorry, and 1.86 kilometers. So it's a little more than our mile here. And the ulama say that it's basically the amount of distance one would cover in a half-hour walking at a normal pace for a normal person. So whatever that pace is, not a person who's 6'5" or 4'5". The average height, the average stride, the average pace, half an hour. So if a person finds themselves somewhere and in any direction within half-hour walk, they cannot find water, they are allowed to make tayammum. But there's a very important issue. We touched on it last week. I want to reiterate it here. It is superior, if you find yourself in that situation, to wait until you can find water, as long as you're not waiting to the point of the time of the prayer leaving. So let's say you're out camping and Dhuhr comes in, 1:25, and you're looking around and there's no water, and you've walked a mile and even more and you cannot find water. Do you at 1:25 or 1:30 immediately do the tayammum, or should you wait and see if you do happen to find water at some point later? It's superior to wait if you think you'll find it, right? You may encounter it later, so you can delay the prayer to a point where, as long as you're not leaving the time of the prayer. That's a superior thing to do. The other reason we mentioned is extreme cold. And what is cold for one person may not be cold for another person. So there has to be some kind of guideline, a dhabit, for what is extreme cold that would allow us to use dry earth for tayammum. And the scholars say that extreme cold is the kind of cold where the person fears that they will likely get sick or they'll damage the limbs if water is used, and they do not have access to any means of heating the water. Sickness as well, it's a relative thing. If a person is afraid that using water is going to lengthen their sickness or worsen their sickness, then they can use the tayammum. And this goes back to prior experience. Like they've had an experience in the past where they were sick and with a similar sickness, and they used water and they got sicker, or the sickness lasted longer than it would have normally. Or they have the testimony of an upright Muslim physician who says, based on your condition, using water is inadvisable. It may likely worsen your sickness. So there is some relativity there, but a person should use taqwa and not just say, I'm going to avoid because it's uncomfortable. It has to be uncomfortable to the point where you have reasonable fear that you're going to get sick, or it'll worsen or prolong the sickness. Likewise, having wounds on most of the body would allow for tayammum. Fear of thirst would allow for tayammum. If a person's traveling, for instance, and they're afraid that if they use the water they have, they're going to become dehydrated, or someone with them will, or even their animal if they're riding a horse or something, whether it's in that moment or later on in the journey. That example is one you find in the books of fiqh, describing a pre-modern period where people would travel from place to place on animals, and there were not readily available sources of water between point A and point B. Think of a desert environment or a mountainous, porous area where there's not much settlements, and a person has to go from this village to that village, and there's no water, and they have water with them, and the time of prayer comes, and sure, they have water, but it's really hot outside, and they have distance to cover, and they're legitimately scared that if they use that water for wudu, they're not going to have enough water to drink until they get to their destination, either for themselves or for someone else on the trip, or even the animal, whether that is at that point or further along the journey. Now, this doesn't really apply to us, but these things are good to know. Likewise, lacking the means of taking water out of a well. You don't have the bucket. You have the well. You can see the water, but you have no bucket. Or if you're afraid of missing the funeral prayer or the Eid prayer. We mentioned this last week, that why is it allowed for us to make tayammum if we're afraid we're going to miss a janazah or Eid prayer? Let's say you come into the masjid here. We have restroom facilities. We have wudu facilities, right? You walk in. Is there a scenario where you can make tayammum even though you're not sick and there's water right here? There is a scenario, and that is if you're afraid you're going to miss the funeral prayer, or if you're going to miss the Eid prayer. But why is that? And why isn't that allowed for dhuhr? Exactly. Because there's no qada, there's no makeup for these things. If you come into the masjid and the jama'ah has already prayed the janazah prayer, you don't do your own janazah like a makeup janazah. If they pray their Eid, you're not doing their Eid as a makeup. So because of that distinction between these prayers and the regular prayers, there's an allowance to make tayammum because of the short time. In any other circumstance, obviously you wouldn't do that. So this is one allowance. We mentioned that there's you can make tayammum with any pure substance of the earth except for two things. What are those two things? What's that?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
If there is shortage of time, for example, you wake up like for flight, and the time is the sun is rise, so you don't have much time before you can go for
Mm-hmm.
Can you make
Some of the madahib do allow that. Others would say you make the wudu even if the time runs out, and it will just be qada because the time has passed. So it's preferable to make wudu in this case. And just the niyyah would be a little bit different, because if the time has passed, say even by a minute, the niyyah is not ada, like doing the current prayer in the current time, because that time has passed by even by 1 minute. You make the niyyah of qada even though a minute has passed. So in the case of tayammum, going back to this question, Allah Ta'ala tells us in the Quran that we're allowed to make tayammum with sa'idan tayyiba, with pure earth. So there are two things we could say that are from the earth, so to speak, from which we cannot make tayammum, or by which we cannot make tayammum. What are those two things? So metals, things that are malleable. Malleable here meaning they can melt. So you can smelt steel or iron and you can make it into another shape. So even though that's coming from the earth, because it's malleable, you don't use that for tayammum. And the second thing would be wood, or anything that produces ash, right? Anything that produces ash. A tree grows from the earth, so it is attached to the earth in that sense. But you can't strike the tree with the intention of tayammum and then do that, because if you burned it, it would turn to ash, which leaves you with basic earth. Because if you take earth and you burnt it, it's not going to melt and it's not going to turn to ash, right? So let's say you go back to this question. The tayammum, the earth we can use, is pure. There's no impurities mixed in with it. Likewise, it's not anything malleable like metal or something that could turn to ash like a tree or bushes or the like. What about making tayammum with stones? Would that be allowed? It would be, because the stones are from the earth. If you take some dirt and you'll see microscopic little tiny stones. So one's tiny and one's larger. They all come from the same source, it's the earth. So according to the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, you can use a stone to make tayammum with. You can also use dust that's from the earth covering a surface. If you were to strike that, you could use it, right? And this is why we said in Morocco, North Africa, you often find in the masajid they have these stones, and that's for tayammum, right? I remember someone visiting Morocco when I was living there, and they said, I found something very strange here in this country. I don't understand it. I go into the masajid and I see these round stones. It's very mysterious. What are these round stones doing in the masajid? What's going on? Is there some kind of weirdness? I said, no, it's just for tayammum, you know. The elderly people come and it's winter time, it's very cold, and they're not able to use the water, so they'll come in and they just do the tayammum using the stone. And there are people who keep these kinds of stones in their houses in case they're unable to make wudu, they're sick. This way they don't have to go outside to do the tayammum on the ground out of convenience. So you could do that. So sand, dirt, limestone, stones, dust, as long as it's from the earth. Now the process of tayammum we talked about is very, very simple. All you do is make an intention to remove the status of al-hadath al-asghar, the status of ritual impurity. So unlike wudu and unlike the ghusl where the intention is a sunnah, for tayammum the niyyah is required, because this is a rukhsa. It is a very specific way of lifting the state of ritual impurity. It requires an intention. And then after that, you strike the earth. with your hands once, and you wipe your face completely, covering every little crevice and area, making sure. And then you strike the earth again, or the object, and you do your hands, including the arms, including past the elbows, just like you would when you're making wudu. All right? So this is the basic process of tayammum. And as long as you fulfill these conditions, it's valid. And you can use that for that salat and sunnah salat. In the madhab of Imam Malik, you can only use it for that salat. And each time a new salat comes in, if you have to make a new tayammum if you can't make wudu. Right? So it's only for that prayer. So this is it. Wounds, bandages, and casts, this is actually related to what we're going to introduce tonight. This is still in our review. A person has, let's say they're cooking and they're cutting up onions, and they get distracted and they cut their finger. They have a boo-boo, and they go and put a Band-Aid on it. When it comes time for salat, are they required to remove that Band-Aid? Or are they allowed to wipe over it? What's that?
Depending on the size. Yes.
And the Shafi'iyya. Depends on the size. So basically, if it's not going to heal properly, you keep the bandage on. If you can take it off and it's not going to affect it anyway, you can take it off. But if it's going to be prolonged, then you have the bandage, you keep it on, and you just wipe over this area, right? You don't have to worry about whether it was put on before or after wudu. The key here is what is going to prolong. Is removing it and washing it going to prolong the injury or not? Now here in the slide, it talks about wounds, bandages, and cast. So it's not just wiping over the bandage, it's also wiping over the wound without a bandage. And in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, if a person has wounds on his or her body, but the uninjured limbs are more than the injured, they must wash the uninjured limbs and then wipe the wounded limbs as long as the wiping isn't going to hurt them. Otherwise, they leave the limbs, neither washing nor wiping. So let's say you have a laceration on your arm, and you have, it's time for salat, you go to make wudu. Do you have wounds on most of your body? No. And by most, they mean the two arms, the two legs, and the head, right? The majority of those are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you have 3 out of 5 of those with wounds, that's the scenario it mentions here. But if you just have one wound, what do? It mentions that you, if the wiping is going to hurt that wound, it's going to reopen it, whether bandaged or not, then you neither wash it nor wipe it. So you just wash the area around it, and you're not touching that area with water, you're not wiping it, you're not washing it, because it's going to make it worse, right? I don't know what scenario that would happen, right? Most people would deal with that by bandaging it up, getting stitches or whatever, but let's assume maybe it's a scrape, maybe it's a really bad scrape and they haven't bandaged it, and to wash it would somehow make it worse. In this case, they just wash around, they make wudu around it and they don't bother. If they have bandages on that, whether it's or a broken limb, and they here it says if they have a broken or wounded limb and cannot wipe over it, meaning the flesh, the actual body, they wipe over the cast or the bandage or dressing, as long as the excuse remains, even if it was placed while the person was in a state of major or minor ritual impurity. So let's say you don't have wudu. You're outside playing in the park, you slip and fall, you scrape your knee, and it's really bad, and you can't really wipe over it. So anyhow, you wrap it up, you bandage it. You don't have wudu. You wrapped it up, and you are not in a state of wudu. As you make wudu, you wipe over this, even though you didn't have wudu when you put it on. Or to be more precise, you don't wipe over the area like your hand, which you would normally be washing in wudu, even if you put this on before wudu. If that cast or bandage falls off and the limb hasn't healed, the previous wiping and prayer are not invalidated. So there's a lot of leeway here in the event of a wound or a break requiring a bandage and the like. So basically, you use it until it's better, and then you go back to wudu when everything is better. Very simple. So this is there's a lot of ease in this. Are there any questions about the ghusl, the tayammum, or this issue before we go to the new material, namely wiping over the socks and najasa?
One of the questions to go back, can we use sand? Because if we burn sand, we can turn that to glass. So can we use sand or not?
That's a good question. I mean, the ulama say sand is valid, right? It's a very good question the way you word it, because if sand is heated up, it can be turned to glass. So in that sense, it is malleable. But the ulama say sand is valid because it's from the earth. Yeah, I'm sure you could, grind something into a fine substance and make it malleable. But this would be what is normally malleable through fire, like smelting iron and the like. Yeah.
Not the grass, right?
Yeah, you can make tayammum with grass, right? That's connected to the earth. You would have to make wudu with tayammum with the actual earth. Yeah. Any?
The hukum about wounds, bandage, and cast applies to ghusl as well, right?
Yes, because whether, as it says here in the slide, whether the person was in a state of major or minor ritual impurity. So whether the person they're making wudu or ghusl, as long as they have a cast or a bandage, then they wipe. So if they're taking the ghusl, then oftentimes what they do in this day and age is they'll put some plastic something around it to protect it, and the person just wipes over that area afterwards or during it, and that's sufficient, right? Because water is not going to reach underneath, nor should it, and whether it's a wudu or a ghusl, you're allowed to wipe over it until it's better. Yes?
When you're at the point in the Maliki school during ghusl, you said wash your head 3 times, right arm, left arm.
But this is the world of Imam Abu Hanifa tonight. This is all Imam Abu Hanifa's madhab, which represents the madhab of the majority of the community. But we mentioned, a little bit here and there from the other schools. There's not a lot we're mentioning from the other schools here. We will be talking about a lot from the other schools in Salat, in the next module.
So did you mean to wash the whole head or just the top?
For ghusl, the whole head. Yeah, every inch of the body and the schools have to be covered with water.
No, what I mean is, when you said, you wash your head 3 times in the right arm and the left arm.
Right.
I was referring to at that point, would you wash the whole head 3 times or just here?
No, the whole process will be 3 times. So if you're washing the head, right side, left side, torso, then that's once. And then you do it again, and then you do it a 3rd time. So it's not 3 for the head and then 3 for this. If someone did that, it will still be valid, but the way it's described as sunnah is 3 times for the entire process. That process repeated 3 times. Yeah.
So it's more applicable when you're using the bucket.
Yeah, this is absolutely. This is mostly applicable when a person's doing the bucket style bath, which is, that's the norm for most of humanity, right? People who have grown up here don't realize that, but that's the norm, right? Here, the shower is running, often way too long. It runs longer than it needs to be, but as long as the water is constantly flowing and you're just doing the wiping part, each complete wiping, and that counts as 1, and then you just repeat it. Yeah. Okay. If there's no more questions, we'll go on to the new material, and it's just 2 issues. Wiping over footwear and understanding impurities, what they are, and how to remove them. The word here, footwear, is intentionally ambiguous because the Arabic word is, or the phrase is, al-mashu al al-khuffayn, literally wiping over the khuf. Now, oftentimes the khuf is translated as the leather socks, and that's accurate. However, the khuf applies to more than just the leather sock. It applies to things that fit the same description as a leather sock. So we'll talk about that first, and then najasa. What is impurity? How do we remove them? And then a few miscellaneous issues toward the end. So wiping footwear. Wiping the khufs is a dispensation. It's a rukhsa conveyed to us by the Prophet ﷺ through mass transmission, meaning this is something so widely transmitted from so many people that it has the same level of textual authority as the Quran. And this is why the issue of al-mas' al-khufayn is mentioned in books of Aqidah. What does wiping over the socks have to do with theology? It has nothing to do with theology in itself, but it's mentioned in the books because there were people in the earlier period who denied the validity of wiping over them, even though they were mass transmitted hadith. So it was less about the legal issue and it was more about affirming what comes through unimpeachable textual authority. So it's something well known in the religion to be valid. And it is a rukhsa, it's a dispensation, which means that it's not a free-for-all. You can't just do it the way you want to do it. There has to be certain conditions. And the key to understanding the wiping over the khuf is that the wiping over it is a replacement for water coming in contact with the foot. So when you make wudu fully, washing your feet, and then you put on the khuf, when you break your wudu and make your wudu later on and you wipe over the khuf, the wet hand wiping over the surface of the foot, the khuf, that is a replacement for washing the feet. It's a badal, replacement for the act of washing the feet. What this means is that water cannot reach the feet, because if water is reaching the feet, then it's no longer a badal, it's no longer a replacement, because the water is reaching what was to be washed originally. So water cannot reach the foot for the wiping to be valid. So what are these conditions? Some of the schools have stricter conditions than others, and some have more lenient conditions. The school of Imam Abu Hanifa is kind of in the middle in terms of leniency. The strictest is that of Imam Malik, because in his school you can only wipe over leather socks. They have to be from jild, from leather. They cannot be of any other material. But in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, the material must be thick, such as leather and wool, and due to their thickness, they remain on the foot without having to be tied, with the exception of a zipper which is attached to them. So let's, if you can imagine a piece of leather hide, is 1 by 1 foot, and you put your foot in the middle of that and you gather it up and then you put a string around it. Is that valid? No, because it doesn't hold up on its own. If it has zippers and other things that cause it to be held up on its own, that's fine. But if it, these are the examples they give, not as if someone's going to actually do that, but it has to be a functional piece of footwear and not a makeshift thing that a person just wraps around themselves. Likewise, they can't be see-through, right? That's obvious, because if it's see-through, what's going to happen? The water is going to reach the foot. It will penetrate the material, defeating the purpose of wiping, since water has reached what has to be washed normally. They must completely cover the foot up to and including the ankles. So if a person had those, what do they call them? The tennis socks? No-shows. Is that what they call them now? The tennis socks, the ones that go below the ankle. Let's say you have a leather pair of those. Can you wipe over them in wudu? You can't. Although they're leather, although they stand up on their own, You can't wipe on them because they're not covering the entire surface of what is normally washed. The ankle's exposed. And when you make wudu, you have to wash your ankles and go up a little bit beyond them, including the heels. So those will be exposed. So it has to cover the entire foot, as you see in the picture here, going beyond the ankles slightly, including the ankles. Number 5, one can walk in them at least, give or take, 3.48 miles or 5.6 kilometers, what we call a farsakh, a unit of measurement of distance, without their tearing aside from small holes. You can add a comma there. So what this means is, if you have a pair of khuf, you put them on, you can walk about 5 kilometers and they're not going to tear aside from small holes. So if you walk that distance, you may get a few small holes. It's entirely possible. A lot of people, or most people even, when they walk, you'll notice it when you walk barefoot in the sand, that you put your weight on certain parts of your foot. And the way you do that is a little different from someone else. So some people, they put more weight on the ball of the foot. Some people, they strike with the heel, and you'll see more pressure in the footprint. And you can even see that with your socks. If you have socks that get holes, you'll notice the holes always appear in the same places. And these are the places where there's the most contact with the ground. So that could be the ball of the foot or whatever. If you're wearing these kinds of socks, pictured in this slide, there's a good chance that walking 4 or 5 miles, you're going to get a couple of holes. It's quite possible, especially on rough terrain. But if the holes are small, that's fine, because it doesn't mean you don't get any kind of tear whatsoever. It's just that the tearing cannot be greater than the size of basically your 3 toes. Right? It can't be a large hole. If it's small, it's fine. And lastly, water does not seep through them when wiping. So if you poured water, you dripped water, it's not coming through and penetrating. So leather socks work. Waterproof socks will work. Even thicker wool socks will work. And you can tell they'll work because if you put on the wool sock and you pass water over the surface or even dripped like this, the water will not penetrate to the bottom and make your foot wet. And if you walked in that wool sock, you might get a hole, but it's not going to rip apart. It's not so flimsy that it rips apart. Now, think about those business socks. How do you think those would stand up to a 5-mile hike? They would disintegrate. They're so thin, right? So you get the idea. The fuqaha are describing basically the qualities needed for something to stand up where it serves as a replacement for water being used. So if any moment something happens to it, or to reword that, if it has qualities that render it not as a replacement for water, because water's getting in, you can't wipe over it. So let's say you have a nice pair of khufs, or you have a pair of waterproof socks, and you're ready to wipe over them. What do you do? How do you do this? This is useful in the wintertime, here especially. And many people who work in a more corporate environment find this is useful knowledge because they don't want to be that guy. You know, that guy who you have your foot in the sink as Bob walks in and doesn't know what's going on. So people like to have this option to wipe over the socks in the corporate environment, which is fine. They just need to know how to do it properly. So the basic rulings, number 1, you have to make wudu, like proper wudu, before you put on the socks. If you just put on the socks without wudu, you can't wipe over them. You have to make a proper wudu, washing your feet, and after that you put on the socks. Once you put on those socks, you have 24 hours to wipe them if you're a resident. And if you're on a journey, you have 72 hours. So 3 days, 3 nights, 72 hours to wipe over them. But when does the time start for wiping? Does it start from the moment you put them on? So if you put them on at 7 a.m., and you can wipe them until 7 a.m. the next day? No. The 24-hour clock starts the moment you wipe them after you've broken your wudu. So let's say you put on you make wudu at 7 in the morning. You put on these khufs, and you have wudu until 10 in the morning, but you're at work. You don't make wudu until 1 o'clock for dhuhr. And at 1 o'clock you wipe over the khuf. How much time do you have left to wipe over the khuf? At what point would it elapse? 1 o'clock the next day, exactly. Now, most people wouldn't do that. But again, that's because we live lives of great convenience and ease. When I was in Yemen, living in this small, cold mud house, I took advantage of wiping over the khufs on that 24-hour period, and I would just take them off, make the wudu, put them back on, and count another 24 hours because it was that cold. You would wipe over them because, it was really cold. So you basically time it from the moment you wipe over the khufs, and after you've, so the time during one may wipe them begins from the moment wudu is broken after having worn them in a state of ritual purity. So this is in the Hanafi school. So the time during one may wipe them begins the moment wudu is broken after having worn them in a state of ritual purity. So that's actually different from what I said. In the Hanafi school, it would be the time you broke wudu, not the time you wiped. So there's these variations. That's the more conservative view. Each khuf has to be free of holes that, if combined, would be equal to the surface area of one's 3 smallest toes. If the holes are less than that area, it's still valid to wipe them. This goes back to the issue of any kind of breaks or holes in the sock. As long as they are not larger than the size of your 3 small toes, it's fine. But if the hole becomes larger than that, you have to take them off and resort back to your regular wudu. And to wipe them, you just begin at the toes, and you, with your fingers moistened from the water, you basically wipe upwards going towards the shin. Very simple. And you're only wiping the tops, you're not wiping the bottoms, just the tops of the socks, both of them. You could do it with the right hand, this, and the left hand for that, simultaneously, however. And this is how you wipe over the socks. Now, the wiping of the socks is invalidated by anything that breaks the wudu, or taking one or both of them off, or if the time expires, or if most of one foot leaves the khuf. So say it starts to come off and most of your foot comes out of it, not all of it, you'd have to go back to wudu. That would invalidate the wiping. And that's fairly basic, because if you take them off, they no longer serve the purpose. Now, here's a little question for you. So we have these pictures here. On the far right, we have these tennis socks. Can you wipe over those? Why not? They don't go above the ankle, but there's another thing missing. They're not really waterproof. Those are thin enough to where water would penetrate and reach the feet. What about the ones next to them? Those are see-through. Those are the ones that would just rip, 1 mile into walking in them. They're see-through, they're too thin, water would penetrate. You can't wipe over those. So business socks and things like that. The next picture we have, these are thick wool socks. Can you wipe over these? Oh, possibly. We'll assume you can, because water likely will not penetrate. What does it mean when we say water doesn't penetrate? Do we mean that water won't penetrate if you turn the faucet on full blast and put the sock right there? No, water will penetrate a khuf if you do that. We're not talking about that. We mean that if water is dripping from the hand, or if you wipe over it, water is not going to seep through and reach the surface of the foot. So it seems like it would hold up, and this would count as valid to wipe over in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa. Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah used to hold a different view. He viewed that it was invalid except for the leather socks, like Imam Malik. But the Sahibain, his two students, and who were mujtahids in their own rights, Imam Muhammad Hassan Shaybani, they took this view, and he took that view back. Last picture. These are, I guess, waterproof socks. They call them sealskins, and there's other brands. These are literally waterproof socks. Can you wipe over these? Of course. So none of these are leather socks, right? And of them, 2 you can wipe over and 2 you cannot. Leather socks, obviously, you can wipe over them. And of these, just 2. There are people, unfortunately, who take a very liberal view when it comes to wiping over socks, and they have no problem wiping over your typical, ordinary socks, whatever they are, and water gets through them. And they say, well, no, the hadith says you can wipe over the jawrab, and this is a jawrab or a sock, therefore, but that's invalid because the jawrab that's described in the hadith has certain qualities. What about wiping over shoes? Right, so there's some detail here. In the books of fiqh, they would call this the jarmuq, which is a kind of shoe or leather footwear that goes over the khuf in cold weather, like a kind of boot. You can wipe over them, but the same conditions apply to them as applies to the khuf. So you'd have to put them on the khuf and those on while in wudu. You make the wudu and have both on. If you've made wudu and you put on the khuf and then you broke your wudu, but then later on put on the shoes, you can't wipe over the shoes. You wipe over the khuf, right? If the time expires, what do? Do you have to make wudu all over again from scratch? No. Let's say you have a 24-hour period and you've been wearing the khufs. The time is up. In the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, all you have to do is take off the khuf and wash the feet, as long as you had wudu at that time. So let's say you have wudu, the time is up, take them off, wash your feet, and you're fine. If time elapsed, you broke your wudu, you just do the wudu over again. I mean, that's unlikely to happen, but these are things we need to know. Any questions on the khuf?
Doing stuff. So, like you talk about when you wash one limb, not let the one be all dry. How that apply to my khuf? So, like when I make wudu in the bathroom, should I make the mask in the bathroom, or I can do it where I pray?
I mean, the idea is that the basic time for muwalat is the time it would take for the normal limb to dry. So if you just make the wudu in the bathroom and then you do the wiping when you walk out, that's still a short amount of time. If, say, 5 or so minutes elapse, that will be the normal time for a limb to dry. So you would want to avoid that. Yeah. Yes?
So can you wear like athletic socks that cover the ankle, put on your shoes, be good that way?
If the shoes went above the ankle, right, like high tops, theoretically you could wipe over them. Yeah, provided all these conditions were met, you could. Regular tennis shoes that are below the ankle would not meet that condition, because they would have to again replace water encompassing the entire area where water would normally reach. So it would have to be high tops or something like that, or boots. So in the books of fiqh they mention the khuf, but also the jarmuq. The jarmuq is like a boot. So that's why you go to the first slide, it says wiping over what? Footwear. So as long as the footwear, whatever we call it, meets these conditions, you can wipe over it. If they don't meet the conditions, you can't wipe over it.
So is it permissible to pray with shoes on?
Yes, it is permissible to pray with shoes on as long as there's no najasa, no impurities on the bottom. In fact, this was the established practice of the Prophet ﷺ. They would pray inside of the masjid with the shoes on. The surface of the masjid was of sand and dirt and rock and the like. And if anyone had najasa, as we'll learn, you get the najasa if it's a solid najasa, by wiping the area and then coming into the masjid. In today's time, because of the porous surface of carpets and these things, we don't do that. Someone tries that, they may get a beating, and some people try it and then, things happen, right? But if a person's out in public somewhere, they want to pray, they don't have to take off their shoes as long as there's no najasa on the surface or beneath them. Yeah.
I have a question. While I was on Hajj in 2016, I saw a girl in my tent when we were at Mina. It was Fajr time, and she had a spray bottle, and she was making wudu with a spray bottle. Is it allowed if you have access to the sink?
As long as the water reaches every inch of her limbs in the wudu, it's fine. Yeah, whether it is a spray, whether it is a rag, whatever is moistening the body, as long as water's reaching every inch of the surface, that's fine. Because it's just a way of administering the water. That could be a water bottle, it could be a spray bottle, it could be a faucet, it could be a drip, it could be a bucket, and you're just dipping your hand. The way the water is administered is not that important as long as water is reaching the limbs. Khair. So let's go to the next section, and that is najasa. I hope you like my picture here. I didn't put an actual picture of najasa. So najasa, we know that a condition of salat is that your body, your clothing, and your place of prayer are free of najasa. Now, najasa is it's a substance, it's something that is ritually impure. So there's the purity we make when we make wudu and ghusl. We're not removing, we're not najis, right? As human beings, if you're as a mu'min, and mu'min la yanjas. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu says, in the hadith in Sahih Muslim, he went to go make the ghusl and he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, I was najis. And the Prophet ﷺ said, the believer is never najis. So it's not that you are impure, but you're removing the status of ritual impurity. But this is najasa in the physical sense, actual substances. Things that cannot be on your body, that cannot be on your clothes, that cannot be on your place of prayer for your prayer to be valid. And the fuqaha, the jurist, mentioned that there's two types of najasa. The first is heavy, mughallada, and the second is light, mukhaffafa. What's the difference? Why is that important? The distinction is only with respect to the amount of najasa that could theoretically be on your body or clothing, but which would be excused, right? But either heavy or light, if any of that enters some liquid, the entire thing is najis, right? That doesn't matter. We're only looking at heavy and light in terms of which types would be allowed in minute amounts and which types would not be allowed in minute amounts. And how much is that? And so heavy and light, what are these types? Basically, the heavy najasa is spilled blood from humans and animals. Spilled blood from humans and animals. If a person is bleeding and that blood drips on your limb or on your clothes, that's najasa. If it's your own blood, same thing. Your blood is not najis while it is in your body. But once it has exited your body and is spilled from your body, it becomes ritually impure and you have to remove it. The same thing for the blood of animals, except for what remains in the meat and the vessels of an animal slaughtered according to Sharia. Now, if the blood is shed during the slaughter, that would be impure. But if there's any blood left over within the meat after it's been drained and you just get this blood, that is pardonable. That's an exception here. And one note on the issue of blood. Do any of you like raw steaks? You know, people think there's blood in the steaks. There's not actual blood in raw meat. What you see in the raw meat is not blood. It's called myoglobin, which is basically a protein that delivers oxygen to the animal's muscles. It's not actual blood. And if a person was to cook a steak, very, very, very rare, blue as they call it, and it appears to be bloody, that's not blood. And you could eat that. That's fine. What is haram to eat of blood is what is shed directly from the animal, right? Masfuh. So it's basically coming out of the animal directly. Blood from humans or animals. Feces of any land animal, whether it's predatory or otherwise. Wine, khamr, any intoxicating drink is najis. Sperm or sexual fluid, male or female, many. Urine, and you can't really see it here, a mouthful or more of vomit. That would be najis. These things are impure, and these are heavy impurities in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa. The light impurities would be the urine of animals whose meat is permissible to eat. So cow, goat, sheep, and so on. Also the urine of horses. Now there's a difference of opinion among the fuqaha about whether it is halal to eat the meat of horses. I'm looking for someone, they're not here. In some regions of the world, horse meat is a common meat. So the view within the school, the sounder view on which fatwa is given is permissibility. But the urine of horses is considered a light najasa because of the use of horses for travel, for other uses, and it's a blessed animal. The droppings of birds whose meat is not permissible to eat, so eagles, falcons, and hawks. So what this means is if an eagle was to fly by you and drop something, that would be a light najasa. Now we're going to learn what's the distinction between heavy and light in terms of what's excusable and what's not and how much. But these are the najasat. Are there any questions about this? Just to get that out of the way. Yes, this is the second time you've mentioned that. I know in the Shafi'i school they have a
Human, like you mentioned, that is pure.
right. They say the human is pure. Meanwhile, if you shake your wife's hand and say goodbye, you have to make wudu. Right? So the Shafi'i school is very strict in that, but very lenient in this. That's what happens in all of the schools. There's views that are very lenient compared to other schools, and in those other schools there are views that are more lenient than that one, and so on. So if a person says, I want to learn one madhab that's the easiest of all four, good luck, because what's easy here will be a little more difficult here. So how do we remove these things? So we mentioned heavy and light, but there's another kind of division of najasa in terms of what is visible and what's not visible, what is discernible and what is indiscernible. So discernible najasa is that najasa that can be seen after it is dried. So blood is najis, and if blood dries, you can see it. It's a very visible dried blood stain. That's a discernible filth. The indiscernible filth will be any filth that once it dries, it can no longer be seen. So that could be something like urine. Now sometimes urine or the traces of urine can be seen after it's dried if it's yellow, but oftentimes there's no color remaining after it dries. So some things dry, leaving no trace, some things dry, leaving a trace. And there's a distinction between these types of najasat in terms of what is discernible and what is not after it dries. So if it is discernible, so let's say a blood stain. If it's discernible, it's purified by removing it, even if you just wash it once. Even if you just wash it once, if you washed it once and it went away, you don't have to wash it 3 times. You're fine, just once. If it requires more than once, you just keep doing it until it goes away. And at some point, if it loses if it basically is removed except for some trace and you can't get it out because of a stain, it's pardoned. Now, what is difficult to remove by definition is anything that cannot be removed by ordinary water. So to remove this najasa, it doesn't mean you have to heat up the water or use soap. If you have to heat up water or use soap or other chemicals to remove it, that is now what is difficult to remove. And that requires going through that process, right? You need to use these things to get rid of it. If you do all that and there's still a color remaining, that's pardoned. Indiscernible, such as, say, urine that's dried on an article of clothing, a place with indiscernible filth is purified by washing and squeezing the area 3 times. So let's say, parents, for the first couple of years, you're dealing with this a lot. Soiled clothing from children. What do? If it's urine, you basically wash that once, squeeze it out, wash it again, squeeze it out, wash it again, squeeze it out, and you're done. That's what you need to do. Because it's not discernible. There's nothing that's remaining for you to remove. You've just rinsed it out and you're good to go. So let's say you have a kid and they had an accident on the carpet. Okay? It's indiscernible, but you can't exactly take the carpet and wash it with water and wring it out 3 times. It's too heavy. What do? Or, it mentions it here in the slides. If the area cannot be squeezed, then it's purified by washing it 3 times, waiting between each wash until the water stops dripping. So if it's a carpet, you would wash the surface, wait for it to stop dripping so that moisture kind of dissipates, go and do that again, and then wait for that to dissipate, and then do it a 3rd time, and then it dries and you're done. You've removed the najasa, right? So this is what is indiscernible. You can't see it. Now we have a case study here, and we talked about this in one of the Ask the Imam sessions. Someone had emailed this exact question about washing garments in the washing machine. Does that count as removing najasa? And the ulama say that it depends on the type of najasa. If it's a discernible najasa, so say blood, if that washing machine goes through at least 2 rinse cycles with pure water, then you can clean your clothes with the impurities without doing a hand wash before you put it in. Because the first rinse is getting rid of the discernible najasa, and then the second rinse is basically, the first rinse is detergent, so you're getting it out. The second one is the pure water that just completes the process and you're good to go. Because remember, with discernible, you don't have to do it 3 times. You just need to do it enough times to get rid of it. So as long as that cycle, 2 cycles or whatever, gets rid of the discernible najasa, you don't have to rinse it with a hand wash before putting it in the washing machine. But let's say it's a soiled garment, soiled with urine from a baby or a child. That's not discernible. And remember, we said for indiscernible najasa, what do you have to do? You have to wash it and then squeeze it out 3 times. So If the washing machine goes through 3 cycles, 3 rinse cycles, then you can clean your clothes without doing this hand wash. If it's 2 rinse cycles, you need to do that rinse on your own by hand before putting it inside. Why? Well, because if it's only 2 rinse cycles, you take it out, there's still 1 rinse cycle remaining, or there's 1 washing remaining to get rid of that indiscernible najasa. So if you know it's 3 cycles, you're good to go. If it's 2 cycles, do a hand wash, a hand rinse in the sink before putting it inside the washing machine. And going back to the issue of blood or things discernible, if a person's removed the blood stains and they've washed the garments, whatever remains after going through this process is excusable. It's pardonable because what is required is a strong presumption that you've removed the najasa, not absolute certainty. So sometimes you have blood stains, right? You've removed the najasa, but the blood has stained the clothing, but you still remove the najasa from that, even though there's still a stain remaining. That's fine. So that's basically how you do it. Are there any questions about removing najasa? Yeah.
Question for us men, for example. If you notice a couple drop of sperm, do you have to do that with ghusl, or you just change for example?
Yeah, we're gonna get to that in the next slide, because remember we said there is the heavy najasa and the light najasa. Why do we distinguish between them? It's because depending on what type it is, there are certain amounts that if they're on your body or clothes, it's excusable. Meaning if they're there, you're okay, you can still pray, it's not going to make your prayer invalid. But if it goes beyond that, you'd have to remove it, otherwise your salah is invalid. We'll cover that now, inshallah. And I include this in miscellanea. So the amount of heavy filth that's excused for prayer is the size of a dirham. So let's say the size of a silver coin. So now the fuqaha, when they teach this, they often use whatever currency is in their land. They'll say the dirham, or they'll say the size of this, or we'd say a silver dollar or a Susan B. Anthony dollar coin, whatever, the size of a silver coin or a dirham, and they say it's about 3 to 5 centimeters in diameter. If a person had heavy najasa of that size on their body or on their clothes, it would be excused, but it's makruh to just leave that without cleaning it, right? So if we go back to this earlier slide, this means if you had a blood stain, let's say you got a boo-boo from cutting onions, you wrapped the bandage, it came off, and you banged it, and now it's bleeding, and you got a blood stain on your shirt, but it's just a small piece of blood. That's najasa, according to Imam Abu Hanifa. Is that amount pardonable or not? It would be pardonable because it's less than the size of a silver coin. But if you know it's there, it's makruh for you to leave it there without getting rid of it, right? If it is beyond that, so let's say you really hurt yourself, you reopened an old wound, or you cut yourself, and it's larger than a silver coin on the surface, on your body, on your clothes, what's going on here? You have to remove that. If you were to pray with that amount on you, your prayer wouldn't be valid. So that would be excused only if it's that size. Yeah, so sperm and sexual fluid is mughallada, is heavy. Yeah. So if a person finds that on them at some point later, if it's not exceeding that size, then it's makruh to not clean it. However, the prayer will be valid. Or if it's greater than that in size, it will be invalid. So that's heavy filth. Now the light filth, that's an excuse, is what comes into contact with less than a quarter of one's dress or body. So let's just, and this is a lot of material, right? So let's say the urine of animals whose meat is permissible to eat. Let's say goat urine, right? You're around a bunch of goats and you get some goat urine on your sleeve. That's light najasa. So how much of that would be allowed for your prayer to still be valid? If it is less than a quarter of one's dress or body. What that means is a quarter of each piece. So a quarter of your sleeve, a quarter of a pants leg, a quarter of one's scarf, a quarter of one's limb, one's hand. So if it's a quarter or less, that would be pardonable. If it's more than a quarter, you'd have to wash it, otherwise it's invalid. And these are examples of issues that would come up for people who are living in an agricultural environment, farming, animal husbandry, dealing with animals. They're coming into contact with najasa, right? So in our context, ask yourself, if you're at a petting zoo, because you're not farming, you're not dealing with any goats, you're at a petting zoo, and you got some goat urine on your sleeve, are you going to go to dhuhr without washing that? Even if it wasn't dhuhr, you would go and wash that because it's just gross. But if you are a farmer and you're dealing with animals all day long, you need to know, well, what's the minimum, what's the maximum, how do I discern, how do I figure out what's going on, right? And, in some of the schools, there's a certain allowance for people who work in those kind of environments where it's hard to stay away from those impurities. And this could apply to a person working with animals, could be a person who is working in janitorial services, cleaning bathrooms. They may come in contact with najasa that a person working in a corporate environment would never come in contact with. So what may be pardonable for this one may not be pardonable for that one because it's so much easier for them to avoid it. So this is, again, not something that we would really do, but it's good to know these minimums. They say a light spray of urine is excused if the size of each dot is no longer than a pin-sized needle. So the legal reasoning again here is that such an amount is difficult to avoid. The fuqaha mention scenarios where this would actually happen and how to be on guard against it. And a lot of these examples are for environments that don't have sewage. So they say, for instance, if you are outside in an area called the khala, right, the area where a person would relieve themselves outdoors, they say that if the surface, if the ground is hard rock and hardened dirt, you would not want to relieve yourself there because it's likely that urine would splash. Instead, you break the earth up a little bit so that splashing does not occur. If any minute splashing does occur, but it's only the size of a pin-sized needle, that is ma'fu, it's pardoned because it's very hard to avoid such minute amounts. But if it's larger than that and therefore avoidable, that would have to be removed. So an area with filth can be cleaned by al-ma' al-musta'mal, used water, or any liquid that by its nature removes filth. So this goes back to our first class about the types of water. Remember, for wudu, you can't just use any water. It has to be absolute water, ma mutlaq, that is pure and purifying for you to use. But what if it's water that's pure but not purifying? If it's pure but not purifying, you can still use it to remove najasa. So you could use that kind of water, and you can even use any other liquid, provided that other liquid removes filth by its nature. Its sedis is flowing and thin such that it would remove najasa. They give examples like vinegar or rose water. What about removing najasa with olive oil? Would that work? It wouldn't work. It is a liquid, but it's not like vinegar, it's not like rose water. It actually would trap in the najasa more. So you couldn't use that. Likewise, a leather sock or a shoe may be purified by scraping or rubbing the affected area on the ground with dirt if the filth on it has a solid body. We mentioned this earlier in the question about the wearing the shoes. The ground is purified by drying as long as no trace of filth remains visible. So a person may have a piece of earth, some ground, and maybe there was some najasa, some urine on it. You could pour water, sure, but as long as it dried completely, that area would be rendered pure. Likewise, the hide of any dead animal is purified by tanning with chemical agents or other means. The only exception is the skin of pigs and humans. Now, the pigs, people see the humans, you're wondering, why would they say that? Well, it's because human beings are honored by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and includes their bodies, and that hurma remains. So that would not work. As far as pigs are concerned, tanning would not purify them, which means that you have to be careful with footwear, with belts, with wallets. You have to be careful with these things. If the meat cannot be eaten according to Sharia, it could be purified by slaughtering according to Sharia, even though you can't eat it, right? Now, the issue here with pigskin is that you could use it. The issue is there's kind of a doubt, how is this thing being killed? If it's not killed properly, it's not purified by tanning. If the pig was conceivably killed in a proper way, then you wouldn't have this problem. So avoid belts and things that are of pigskin, things like that. So this is miscellaneous issues. Having covered all of this, all we need to cover now are two issues. And we have covered all the areas, or almost all of the areas of purification. And that is bathroom etiquette, namely istinja and istijmar, and the details concerning that. And the last one, hayd, nifas, and istihada, menstruation, postpartum bleeding, and irregular bleeding. And that last one is a little more complicated, and it probably is worth a full class in itself. But what we want to give are the basics that anyone can use to figure out things for themselves, inshallah. And we can address any questions that come up anonymously or by other means. After that, inshallah, we do a review and we want to administer the test, covering just the basics of the types of water, wudu, ghusl, tayammum, all of these things, so that we can then move on to module 5, which is salat. And salat is a lot more familiar to most of us, its details, but there's a lot of important things to cover there. And then from there we go on to zakat, and from there we move on to mu'amalat. We'll talk about hajj a little bit, but we mostly talk about when it's obligatory. We don't go through all of the manasik. We then go into mu'amalat, transactions, buying, selling, marriage, divorce, rights, the huquq of other people, all of these things. And then we get to the akhlaq, the different aspects of spirituality that we must know. Wallahu wa rasuluhu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallama ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.